Well, this all sounds like great news. Who doesn't want to be helped out by buddies who are doing well economically? But in a piece that you wrote for Fin24, you highlighted that actually it may not be as great as it sounds.
Well, in principle, the idea of providing a balance to the Western institutions, I think, is a reasonably good principle given the very important shifts that are taking place in the world. In practice, though, this bank is likely to have similar problems to the World Bank and to the International Monetary Fund when it comes to lending. I mean, this bank will have to choose very carefully who they lend money to and what kind of oversight there is over those disbursements of cash. One of the big criticisms of the World Bank or the IMF is that when they lend money, they demand certain conditionalities from countries that receive that money. They want those countries to change the economic policies. Of course, when you lend money, you want to make sure that the person who receives the money is actually not going to squander the money and is going to pay back the money, hopefully over time, or pay back the interest over time. The World Bank has got conditionalities attached to lending money. This new BRICS bank is also going to have to adapt and develop models to also secure any kind of loan that it makes to other developing countries for sustainable development projects into the future. So the very conditionalities that many countries have criticized the Western institutions for over the last 20, 30, 40 years could very well become the same conditionalities that the BRICS Bank will have to put into place in order to make sure that it doesn't just lend out money and find itself giving out cash in what could be a bottomless pit.
Now, you've mentioned that the headquarters will be in Shanghai. We know that for the next 6 years at least, there'll be an Indian president. And we also know that there will be a board of governors chair who's going to be Russian and a board of directors chair who's going to be Brazilian. Do you have any indication of where South Africa will fit into this, into the leadership and the running of the development bank?
Well, I think certainly South Africa would have liked to have had the entire institution centered in this country. They didn't get that right. China won that round. As it happens, the bank is effectively headquartered in Shanghai. But South Africa gets effectively an African office representation. So in terms of dealing with African countries who might come to the bank for a loan, those requests will be channeled through the BRICS Bank's office here in South Africa, a regional headquarters, so to speak, for the African continent, and that's where South Africa's pull is going to come from, this structure. The BRICS themselves have tried to spread, of course, the bank's offices through India, through South Africa in terms of the African connection, through China in terms of the front office address. They've tried to make it fairly inclusive for all of the BRICS membership countries. So South Africa will still have a relatively important role to play in terms of its dealing with Africa. But ultimately, I think this bank is going to have to be seen as being a bank that really does look at individual projects that necessitate funding. It should not be seen, of course, as a bank that simply reproduces what has been the Washington consensus in the past with perhaps a new emerging Beijing consensus that we see occurring in the world currently. And I think that South Africa will have to steer, I think, a very careful middle ground to make this bank look as though it really is a bank to support the developing world rather than a bank to support perhaps the geopolitical interests of a very powerful contributor like China.
Now, we can't separate the fact that although the Russian economy looks largely positive, the political situation on the ground in Russia, especially pertaining to Ukraine, their neighbors, is tenuous. So, will the political situations in these separate countries affect the new development bank or the way it's run at all?
Yes, I think that one of the key impediments to any future success of the bank, despite I think its symbolic importance that I've outlined, is that the participants in this bank, the 5 major participants who've put in the seed capital, themselves need to have stable political systems, they need to have growing economies, they need to have efficient and transparent governments in order for the BRICS Bank, I think, to continue to be and to flourish as a core and powerful global institution into the future. It's no good if the Chinese economy starts to falter, or if the Brazilian economy starts to show very sluggish growth combined with internal unrest as we've seen in Brazil. And for that matter, it's no good if a key component country like Russia undergoes great economic decline as a result of Russia's own domestic political and economic issues that plague that society. And in fact, if you include South Africa's rather lackluster GDP growth rate, 4 out of the 5 BRIC countries themselves with the exception to a degree of India, that looks as though it perhaps could restore itself with a new government being elected a few months ago, 4 out of the 5 BRIC countries themselves today look as though they are undergoing a degree of economic transformation which is not growth-oriented. In fact, it's retraction or recession-oriented in some of these BRIC countries. So the great symbolism and excitement surrounding the BRICS Bank, I think, which is an academic concept, could very well be offset by less than adequate economic and political performance coming from the component countries. And I think what the BRICS, the grouping itself, the bank aside, the entire BRICS grouping, does not really have any kind of mechanisms to judge their own membership, their own country's performance in terms of politics and economics. If one country becomes politically wayward, for that matter, how do the other BRICS countries react? And this grouping certainly has no such mechanism to deal with that. So I think the jury really is out on whether the BRICS themselves can perform domestically, economically, politically, and of course whether the BRICS can also find common ground when it comes to global financial structures that they wish to implement within the new bank itself.